This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so yesterday we had kind of started off with a very basic discussion, right? So we started talking about for the first and the most basic thing that we started talking about was that what is economics, or what is economics? So what is at the crux of economics? So at the crux of economics is nothing but a set of incentives, right? And what are these incentives that we are talking about? So it is the incentives of it is the incentives of the producers and the incentives of the consumers. So the most basic type of incentives that we can think about. However, at a very broad level, the incentives are of two types. One is a selfish incentive, and the other is an altruistic incentive. Now, mostly 99% of the economics that we have studied deals with the selfish incentives of individuals, right? And when I say selfish incentives, it means incentives where the person, whether the required or the concerned economic agent is kind of trying to maximize his or her objective functions or their objectives, or as we call it, the payoffs. So basically, let's say, for example, we go to buy a particular commodity, right? Now, for that economic transaction to realize, there must be a price at which I am willing to buy the product, and the price at which the person is, or the shopkeeper is willing to sell the product. So if you have such a unique price, right, and you have such an agreeable unique price, then your transaction is kind of realized. And when I'm trying to pay that price, so my objective would be to maximize my satisfaction. On the other hand, if I'm trying to maximize my profits, it would be so. If I'm the producer or if I'm the shopkeeper, I would be trying to maximize my profits. And then what I would be doing is I would be actually looking to charge that price such that my profit is maximized, and as a consumer I'll be willing to make the least possible sacrifice in terms of the money, which would maximize my utility. So I would try to get the best possible goods at the minimum possible prices, and the producer would always try to sell the maximum possible goods or the maximum possible output at the highest possible prices. So so this is what has been the crux of this particular subject, right? And as we kind of move on to the analysis, so basically we say that there are these two broad streams of economics. One is called the microeconomics and the other is called the macroeconomics. So when I talk about the microeconomics, so when I'm trying to assess the when I'm trying to assess the household behavior, when I'm trying to assess the market, or I'm trying to assess the behavior of the smallest divisions of the economy, right? The smallest components, the most fundamental units of the economy, that is called a microeconomy. And when I'm trying to assess the same behavior at an overall level, that is called the macroeconomy, right? So while for microeconomics we talk about demand and supply, right? At the macroeconomy we talk about the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply. So the interpretation of the demand and supply curves also change with changes in this aggregate. With as we move from the demand supply component to talk about an aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So the interpretations of the things change. The interpretations change. The causes which move, which results in the aggregate demand curves to move and the demand curves to move, they also change, their respective interpretations change, and so on. So uh, so yesterday we had created a list of the topics going ahead. So so the most basic part that we start on from our discussion would be the demand curve. Now this is one of the most important and the most basic component of economics, that is the demand. The second So, so we start off from we basically start off with interpreting the demand curve, right? That's the most fundamental part. So our objective over here would be to start off from this fundamental component and gradually kind of build the the concepts one on top of the other. Okay. Now there are three things or three basic concepts that we need to introduce for developing this concept of the demand curve. So the first of the so the first is the concept of a market. A market, and that market is divided into two parts. One is one is your producer, the other is your consumer. Now, in our discussion yesterday, we saw that it is the consumer who is more responsible or which generally drives all kind of economic transactions. So producers may produce, but if you do not have a proper consumption base, then your goods remains unsold, right? So you cannot actually sell your goods. So therefore, it is imperative for us to first start by studying the nature of the consumers. So I have these two broad participants. One is the consumers, the other is the producers, and what we have over here is the market. So before I talk about any kind of transactions which happen, right, we need to understand what exactly do I mean by market in economics. Now, in economics, now generally when I talk about a market, it means it refers to a marketplace, right? A place where demand and supply is, or where there are producers kind of looking for consumers, there are consumers looking for producers, and they are kind of trying to sell, they are kind of trying to bargain, and so on. So basically, so market for us is a place or it's kind of a geographical location where we go every day to buy our day-to-day goods or services. However, in an economics or in the jargon of economics, market does not refer to any physical place. It can be a virtual space as well. So what is the most defining characteristics of a market? So a market is anywhere or it's an institution which lays down certain rules for economic transactions to happen. So market essentially is an institution, right? Why is it called an institution? Because it lays down certain rules and regulation for transactions to happen. So this is how market would is defined in a very broad term in economics. Now, why is it an institution? What type of rules am I talking about? Now, let's say if you go to the shop or you go to the market, right? Uh, and and you go to buy, let's say, vegetables in the market. Now, as you go to buy vegetables in the market, you have many sellers selling the selling the same kind of product within a place, right? Now, there are some people who are charging, let's say, 10 rupees a kilo. There are some people who are charging 12 rupees a kilo. Now, now the entire concept of this market is so if they are charging different prices, so that's the first rule, or that's one of the rules that the market lays down, that the producers can charge or can quote different prices for their goods and services for the goods that they are producing. Now what happens is you kind of travel from one end of the market to the other end or one gate to the other gate and see what is exactly what is the distribution of the prices, and what are the different prices available that is at which the vegetables are being quoted, at a particular vegetable is being quoted. Then what you do is, so that's a second rule. It allows you to explore explore the market from one end to the other. To it actually expose you to go across to any of those buyers, to any of these sellers, and check the prices that they are giving. So that's the second rule that the market has. The third rule is you can bargain. So you bargain the prices at a level, and you start kind of getting it to a level and where you mutually agree upon, and you buy it. Now, one important question over here is that so as you go ahead, or as you start bargaining, so bargaining is one of the features. Now, the question is, why is it that you are kind of bargaining with a few particular sellers and not everyone? Because there are minor quality differences all across, right? So let's say there is a producer who is actually charging a very high price for that vegetable. So on an average, everyone is charging 10 and 11 rupees per kg, and this guy is charging 15 rupees per kg. So no one will be initially buying from him, given that, if I'm talking about a vegetable like a cauliflower or a potato, until and unless there's a huge quality difference, no one is willing to pay that extra penny for buying the same potato. Now, people who are not willing to explore the market and update their information set accordingly, who are very partial to their, who have very partial access to information. Let's say I'm in very hurry, so I get this guy first. I pay 15 bucks a kilo, and I take and I go away. So I have not updated my information set at all. So I take that decision respective to an imperfect information rule. So so that is another rule that a normal market would set to you. So if you want to update your information set, if you are a perfectly rational individual, then what you are expected to explore the market, right? Explore the market from one end to the other end, and choose out that optimal price, that vegetable which is at the optimal price and gives you the maximum satisfaction, and you buy that particular commodity, right? So you are actually making this purchase subject to a set of rules, right? So that's a market. Now, the same market, everything else remaining unchanged, the person is transported to a Walmart store, right? Now the rules change. So there is a specific vegetable section where there is a specific slot and the prices are tagged. So if you have to buy it, you have to buy it at that price. So you don't stand a chance to bargain the price. So in a normal unstructured market, or so that market is an institution which allows a bargaining rule. The structured markets or the structured stores will not allow bargaining. That's a tagged price, right? And all the vegetables that is available there within that part are of more of similar quality. And hence, what you see is that the rules change. Now, let's say, so this is a place where I'm talking where you have physical market existence. Now, think about you being hired by some organization. Your interviews happen, right? And your rounds of interview happen, and then your HR round comes, and then you quote, let's say I want 100% hike in my CPC, and the HR says no, the max you can offer is 35%. So then you say no, 35% is too less. So given so and so skill set, I'm a master in so and so things, I'm a genius in so and so things, I'll not go anything less than a 45% hike. So over here again, there is a price and there is a transaction which is happening, but it is happening subject to a set of rules. So when the company finally makes you an offer and you ultimately bargain for it, that is being done in terms of a set of rules, right? Company brackets, pay brackets, average salaries, skill set, the value of the skill set in the markets, and everything. But that's a transaction that goes on as well, right? So therefore, you cannot actually associate a market with a physical location. A market is anywhere and everywhere where a transaction is done. Stock markets. So even though you have a stock exchange and everything, but most of the transaction happens online, right? Now over there, there is a set of rules again to it. So a market, whenever a transaction is happening, right, is subjected to a set of rules which determines the transaction, and hence the market is an institution. And consumers and producers are considered to be two agents in that institution, the agents who are participating or who are a part of that institution. So the prices which that brings them together is a part of the institution, how it is done, and how is it that the price is adjudged over there, right? And as the rules of this institution changes, so as the rules of these institution changes, right, you will see your market forms are also changing. So let's say a perfectly competitive market. Now in a perfectly competitive market, one of the most important characteristic is that there must be large number of buyers and large number of sellers, such that one single consumer is consuming a very small fraction of the total goods, and one single producer is producing a very small fraction of the overall supply. So that is the first rule which governs the perfectly competitive market. Now when you move from a perfectly competitive market to a monopoly, you say that there is the consumers, there are large number of consumers, but there is one single producer. The moment this rule changes in the market, what happens is that in the institution, right, so in that institution we tend to land up with a different market form. Now the rules which governs the institutions, right, so that determines the market forms that we have. So that determines the market forms, right? So from that, that's why you have perfectly competitive market, you have monopoly, you have monopolistic competition, you have oligopoly, and all the other kind of market imperfections which are there, right? So however, so the most basic and the most prevalent form of market structure that we generally discuss is the perfectly competitive market. So 95% of the neoclassical or 99% of the neoclassical theorization of demand supply, or be it your consumer behavior, producer behavior, or be it the general equilibrium models, is driven by, so this is largely driven by the perfectly competitive market. So mostly what you are trying to see is that given that the market is perfectly competitive, how is it that a consumer should behave, how is it that the producer behaves, such that they can maximize their utilization and their utility and their profits, right? So these are some of the important things that we need to understand, right? So the very basic market structure with which we start our discussion, that we define, is the perfectly competitive market. Now we'll talk about something, that why is it that this perfectly competitive market is so theoretically important, right? So we'll talk about the key characteristics of a perfectly competitive market, and from there we will set this definition, we'll set the definition of the demand curve and the supply curve. So that will form our benchmark models. And so from here, if you move on to the monopoly framework, how is it that demand and supply gets affected? How is it that the welfare of the society gets affected? So if you move from monopoly to monopolistic competition, how does the things change? So what are all these things? So how would a firm behave? How would a consumer behave So these are some of the important questions that we'll talk about. But yes, again, we are not going to look into this market in very detail at this stage. We are just going to define the key terms of rule or the rules of these institutions, and that will provide as a background to develop the demand and the supply theory first, right? So we will talk about demand, and we will talk about some ways of, so there are certain demand control strategies that the governments take, right? So we'll talk about demand from different aspects. We'll talk about the concept of demand from a consumer's perspective. We'll talk about demand from a demand for funds perspective, and we'll come to talk about the different challenges that are there, which is involved in assessing a demand with the demand and supply framework. So we'll talk about many real life examples as well, right? But before I go on to this, I would just take a quick pause, and I would like to take up questions if there are any. Okay. Okay, so if you don't have any questions, you can just type in a good to go, and we'll just move ahead. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Fine. So let's start by talking about the market framework first. So we'll start off by talking about the perfectly competitive markets, and why is it that these markets are called perfectly competitive? Okay, now perfectly competitive markets are, they are kind of an oxymoron, because in perfectly competitive markets, these markets are actually characterized by no competition. So perfectly competitive markets are characterized by no competition at all. But why is it so? So what are the key characteristics of a perfectly competitive market, or the key characteristics that we, talk about, or that we get to see for a competitive market? The first, In a perfectly competitive market, there are large number of buyers and large number of sellers. The number of buyers are so large that one single buyer will demand a very small fraction of the overall demand. This means that he that the buyer cannot would not be in a position to influence the price by increasing his demand for the goods. Similarly, the number of sellers are so large that they cannot influence the price by selling by increasing their production, right? So so the number of sellers are so large that they cannot influence the price by increasing their production. Hence, neither the consumer nor the producer can impact the price. Neither the consumer nor the producer can impact the prices by their individual selling or buying practices. The fifth is there is a perfect information available in the and above all the products produced by the sellers are homogeneous in nature. So these are some of the important points that we generally get to see as a part of perfectly competitive markets. Now, why are these important? Now, the first 2 points, now these are the rules by which a perfectly competitive market would operate. So it clearly says that in a perfectly competitive market, there are large number of buyers and large number of sellers. And it means that each of the individual buyers or the sellers cannot impact the market, right? Now, on the other hand, what it means is that if they cannot influence the prices, the price will be exogenously set. And hence we say that the price in the price of a product in a market or in a perfectly competitive market is exogenously given. So it is kind of decided by an arbitrator. So basically think about it like this, that there is an arbitrator who sits, or there's a social planner who sits there in the market, and there are the producers, there are the consumers. And let's say this guy takes up a cauliflower and says 1 kg of cauliflower is priced at. The producers first quote the price at which they want to sell. Then at the other end, the consumers quote a price at which they want to buy that 1 kg. Then the price keeps on changing quotation, and at the point where they mutually agree on that price, the price where they mutually agree on is the sealed price. So it is generally believed that there is an arbitrator who is, or there's a theoretical arbitrator who sits in the market and kind of decides on the price at which the market clears. And this is called Adam Smith's famous the invisible hand theorem. So this is what Adam Smith called the invisible hand. There is an invisible hand which is deciding whether the prices, or which is deciding what should the market clearing price for the product be. So is it that there is additional demand or an additional supply at a given price, the price is automatically adjust until and unless a price is reached such that both the demand and the suppliers are willing to pay the same price and the market clears. So so this invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about was because of the presence of these large number of buyers and large number of sellers, right? So the price at which all the other people would be willing to buy will be the price at which you would also want to sell, right? Now think about this modern industry, right? So I have been a part of the training industry for quite some time now, right? Now think about it like this, that that initially there were these traditional training houses who used to deliver very specialized training around uh, different areas, right? So let's say when we were kind of entering into the industry, we had these SaaS training institutes who used to charge a bomb for training in SaaS, and R was just coming up at that point of time, and we had SAS and we had Excel at that point of time. So SAS and Excel were the two dominant ETL tools which we were using, and we had IBM using Cognos and all these things. So there were these training institutes who used to charge a bomb for training candidates on the same and kind of helping them upskill. Now think about the present scenario, that and mostly these used to be, your traditional on classroom sessions, and they were kind of charging this money. Now what was the thing then at the time? That price that they were able to charge, or the price they were charging, was because you were kind of limited by geography, right? You were kind of limited by geography, and you had to go to those classes, and in that region there were like one or two training centers, and they used to kind of have their own market shares and enjoying the business. Now the moment, if you think about your time today, right, when you see this COVID fiasco happening all around, and suddenly everything has turned into digital, the moment the things go digital, that local competition is wiped off, and you are now competing with a bigger market, and you have players like Udemy over there, you have players like Upgrad over there, you have players like so you have some other major players who are delivering their online sessions. So suddenly you are actually competing against a price where you are charging, let's say, 20,000 bucks to get yourself trained. You suddenly see that there are other alternate options which kind of gives me a detailed description at around 5,000 rupees, at 6,000 rupees, that even at 100 rupees, 300 rupees, 500 rupees. So suddenly that competition which was there, that price man has suddenly gone out, and now these traditional institutes, they are forced to slash down. their moduling prices. Now, what is the result, or what is the final result of this? The final result over here is the final result here is that in an element of competition, when you have many market players, suddenly you are at the you're kind of your market share suddenly falls from being, let's say, 30% or 35% in the local areas. It suddenly falls to like 0.5% at the national market level. So there are many players who have suddenly gone online, and you have these people who have they set up LMSs and everything, and they are just kind of reaping onto their businesses. So in such a case, suddenly when you are faced with such a tough competition, you have to slash down your price. You cannot keep your price at that exorbitantly high level. So you would see that many of these prices of such products or such trading products gradually being slashed, discounts being offered, and you know different kind of qualitative and quantitative incentives being provided out to the participants to subscribe to these modules. So because they know that they are now actually competing against a more structured player like Upgrad, Udemy, and so on. So now this is what happens in a perfect competitive market. The more number of players you have, the more competitive, the more competition that you have in terms of the number of players, the more competition that you have in terms of the number of in terms of the number of investors. So that moment that you have that, right, the moment your competition increases, you have to slash down price. Otherwise, you'll end up losing whatever market you had, right? So in many such cases, what people try to do is they try to penetrate the market more and into divisible and create more divisible component of their their product, right? So like if you remember Cadbury was one such firm, which was kind of having its monopoly in India, right? But suddenly you see these farms like Nestle coming in there, then you have, you have farms like Amul coming in there, and you have these Indian chocolate brands coming in there. Then there are other foreign brands which are coming into the market. So then what does Cadbury do? Cadbury starts making divisible components, right? So from those bar chocolates that we used to have, right? So they have now broken it down to as small as 50 paise, 1 rupee, right? So that a larger number of people can afford to buy Cadbury, and that will kind of bring up the revenue share. So at any point of time, whenever you are into a market, whenever you are into a market, into a competitive market, and whenever there are multiple players who are competing, that's where your price cutting strategies or your price strategies becomes ineffective. And if you have to survive there, you have to make your products divisible. But the problem with the perfectly competitive market module is the perfectly competitive market is that the products are already considered to be very divisible and homogeneous in nature. So let's say there is a module of Udemy or of the upgrade provided by upgrade on data science, machine learning, and Python, and there is a similar module of data science, machine learning, and Python. Now, if you think at a very higher and overall level, right, uh, the component of the module broadly at a at an overall level is very similar. There might be fine differences in terms of the training and delivery than what upgrade has and what this ABC institution has. So so there is a minor difference. There can be a minor qualitative difference, but at an overall level the product is very homogeneous, right? So your product has now become more or less homogeneous, but there is something which is existent in today's world which prevents this market from being a perfectly competitive market versus something that is not there in a perfectly competitive market, and that's called a brand, the brand recognition. So a degree from Upgrad or a degree from Udemy or a degree from some of these, Alteryx or Tableau, right? These free content learning materials. So what would they do? They will provide you a e-certificate which you can flash on your CV, which may not be the case with some ABC organization, or there would be a difficulty in the brand recognition because these companies have invested in their brands. So this makes the market this prevents the market from being perfectly competitive and makes the market monopolistically competitive, right? Because if you have to make a market perfectly competitive, there must not be any brands, there has to be an anonymity, and the products has to be absolutely homogeneous in nature, right? So so these are the criteria, or these are the reasons, these are the points which ideally happen, right? Or these are the criteria which you must have when you are developing the so when you are actually uh, trying to think about microeconomics. So in microeconomics, so perfect competition is a benchmark state of a market. Now, perfect competition to some extent is seen in vegetable markets, right? Or in markets of perishable goods. So let's say someone is selling a fish, right? So, so how different do you assume the quality of the fish to be from one seller to the other? So that is where it makes the market perfectly competitive, right? So fish market, vegetable market. So these markets are more or less perfectly competitive, but they are not exactly perfectly competitive. So there are potential. So there is a potential of these markets of being perfectly competitive, given that the agents actually use their time and effort to explore the information, right? Whereas uh, perfectly competitive market implicitly assumes that information gathering is something which is costless, but that's not the truth. So there is some, this is where the market, the theoretical markets diverge from the markets real time, and these set of rules define perfectly competitive market as an institution. And based on these assumptions, right, the basic theory of demand and theory of supply is created, right? Okay, so I'll take a pause here. I'll take up questions if there are any, and then I'll then we'll move on. Okay, so Priyanka has a question over here. She asked that the industry decides the price. Is the arbitrator and the industry the same thing? Now, now over here, Priyanka, there is something that we need to understand. When I say the industry decides the price, right? So I'm not talking about the industry. So what is the industry over here? So the example that I gave, if I think about these learning forums, right? If we're learning forums in the education industry, so they actually, so what is the advantage that Upgrade or Udemy would have compared to some other traditional institutes? The advantage that they would have is of a global reach. Their structure, their business model is very different from that of a traditional institute or traditional institution house. So, so when I say the industry decides the price, it is not actually the industry. It is the demand and the way the demand is flowing which is deciding the price, right? So there is an invisible hand which is kind of driving this to an equilibrium price, but you see that there is no such equilibrium price as such, right? So so the more Upgrade or these brands can they influence the market, the more the market share goes in favor of them. Now over here there are different uh, things that you need to understand. Now in this market there are different things. Now one is, let's say, a traditional learning framework versus an online learning framework. So in terms of which these market players are much more advanced than traditional houses. Now, if they go ahead and they invest more into these and they make it more user friendly, so there will be more people going in towards them, right? So they, after a point of time, they start charging a higher price, which which the traditional business houses at that point of time would not be able to do. So it is very difficult to find out a unique price at which the product gets traded. So the so it is very difficult to identify that unique price. So what you can observe over here is that as the market opens up to larger competition, the prices fall. The prices which was restricted to local monopoly falls, right? So this is where So this is where the real-time markets deviate from the theoretical perfectly competitive market. But the fact that the prices, with the increase in competition, the prices fall is something which is representative of the perfectly competitive markets, because the number of suppliers have increased, right? And each of the producers have a limited market share, and they cannot influence the price of the product in the market by their own buying or selling. Therefore, the prices which they are kind of taking is something which the producers are willing to pay. So it is mostly it is decided by the movement of the excess demand and the excess supplies. So in the market, what in a given market, right? When I say this invisible hand, this invisible hand is nothing but it is the result of movements of excess demands and excess supplies. So if you have an excess demand in the market, prices for the products go up. We have an excess supply in the market this goes down. The move and the very thing that the market is actually operating and has not come to a standstill is because the equilibrium price has still not been reached. So there is no one such authority which will come and say that no, you have to charge a price which is less than or equal to this. You cannot charge the price above this. So such regulations are not still present in this industry, and hence attaining a proper perfectly competitive structure is not really possible either in this industry, right? So my objective was to we help you identify the impacts that competition can have, or changing environments and changing market sizes can have on the pricing decisions. So after a point of time, you cannot just change your prices as you want. So you may not be the market may not be charged the same price, but the prices charged are in a similar bracket, right? Now, let's say if someone is providing a particular module at 10,000 rupees and you are charging 18,000 for it. So no one will come to take the module from you. So after a point of time, you have to cut it down to at least, if the market is doing it at 12,000, you have to put in at least a 13,000, and then that can kind of help you get something. Or may not be, or you may have to put it below 12,000 or something like that. So it is totally, so your control over the prices in a market where there are multiple competitors is very low, is lower. And if you have many people and many sellers and many consumers, and the commodity is homogeneous in nature, then you actually have very low level of control left over your price, right? So the arbitrager that we are talking about is nothing but it is the excess demand and the excess supply that appears in the market, and it is these excess demand and excess supply which helps us adjust the prices, right? So any questions on up to the point that we have discussed here? Okay. So, so Shanshari has a question over here, that is invisible hand applicable for monopoly too? No, invisible hand is not applicable for monopoly. In fact, monopoly is considered to be an exception out of the perfectly competitive market structure, right? So it is treated as an exception. So generally it is, so when the neoclassical economics or the classical and the neoclassical economics were being developed, right? So for them, the perfectly competitive market was the norm, and anything outside perfectly competitive market was an aberration. So be it a monopolistic competition, or be it a oligopoly, or be it a monopoly, right? These were all treated as aberrations from the perfectly competitive market, right? Now, it is also like you may, as standing in this 21st century, you may think that why is it that they have talked about perfectly competitive market and the market is theoretical and all. But if you go back in a time, if you take a time machine and if you just go back in time and put yourself in 1776 when Adam Smith was writing his uh, an inquiry into the causes and consequences of the wealth of the nations in 1776, where he was trying to postulate the basic principles of international trade, and he was kind of trying to defy what the mercantilists at that point of time had said, where they had kind of talked about preserving gold to fight, so to limit imports and expand exports. And when he was trying to defy those law norms, and he was trying to talk about the specialization of labor, and he was trying to talk about concepts like absolute advantage and international trade, it was very likely for him to assume a perfectly competitive market. Because think about the market structure in those days. So you would have a perfectly competitive market. So in a perfectly competitive market, there are large number of buyers, large number of sellers. Think about the time when Adam Smith was actually writing the when Adam Smith was actually writing the book. So he was writing it in 1776. That was the period of the Industrial Revolution, just a little post the Industrial Revolution. And once the Industrial Revolution was gone, I mean, once the Industrial Revolution was done, they had huge supplies of goods and services. So there were many people who were kind of buying those goods from the wholesalers and they were selling it in their markets and they were selling the same thing, right? So given that they were selling the same kind of things, right? What is it that why would someone go and buy from someone else? Right. So what they were kind of trying to do over there was there were many people who are buying, let's say, teacups, right? And the teacups and these pots, and they were manufactured uh, in the factories, right, in huge amount, and the products are absolutely homogeneous. Those days, brands were not prevalent. So today, standing today, you think about Gucci, you think about So, so you think about Gucci, you think about some other international brands, let's say Tag Heuer, or you think about some some other brands, let's say Marks and Spencers and so on. But back to those days, all those things were same for everyone. Those goods were homogeneous. You did not have such brand influences, right? The impact of brands have been identified in today's world, right? Which makes us deviated from the so that has kind of helped us deviate from the perfectly competitive market. But assume for the in those days there were no brands, right? So everything was homogeneous. If it was oil, it was only oil which people were buying. If it was teacups and it was just crockeries, they were just buying crockeries. So so not many of the people would have had the incentive to change their prices, right? So charging a unique price or charging the same the price that market has decided was the Nash equilibrium for them. So that price was such a price which which would be the best for them to charge because they had no incentive to deviate away from that price, right? So one of the important things that came out, so perfect competition and assuming perfect competition to be the norm was a characteristics of those days. And then the theory has kind of kept on going and the principles have had been developing. Now, the market aberrations have started happening from the time, right, towards the late uh, 19th century and the beginning of 20th century, right? And then you have the 21st century and then the 22nd century now. So what happened over there was that when you have these Britishers coming in and when you had this demonstration effect setting into the DNAs of these colonized nations, did the concept of brands actually come in, right? So if you talk about, so if I am to actually buy my office formals, right? I would kind of uh, go ahead and buy it from a foreign brand rather than buying it from someone who is Indian, right? I would rather buy it from Peter England, which is ideally an Indian brand, right? Just because of the name that it's Peter England, right? So I would always prefer to look for a Burberry to make a suit rather than doing a suit from some of any of the Indian shops. Even though Burberry may cost me around like 4 lakh plus to make a suit, right? But because I want to show it that I have the affinity for foreign brands, and by consuming foreign brands, I obtain a mental satisfaction of being a superior person compared to the others. Like, so being all kind of Veblen effect and all kind of bandwagon effect kind of sets in, a snob effect kind of sets into me. But still, I would prefer to do that, right? Rather than uh, going to an Indian shop and buy things out. So these the affinity for brands and the market distortions have had begun as a result of colonization. So colonization runs deep into it, and it is because of colonization and a demonstration effect and a will to feel superior and level with the colonizers that we had started that these affinity for the brands have started, right? Nowadays, the story may be a little bit different because uh, with these foreign uh, with these foreign brands gaining the marketplace that they have today, they've invested a lot of into research and development and into quality control, which obviously makes their products far better in terms of feel, in terms of much more value for money in today's world. But again, somewhere deep down, if you go back and if you trace the roots back to this brand affinity, it is the roots lie in the history of colonization. So this story that the perfectly competitive markets and this entire stand of neoclassical economics, the fact that it stands on perfectly competitive markets is because the markets those days, if you go back to 1776 England, you will see that the markets were kind of pretty so there were shops who were selling similar goods, right? And hence they had to charge more or less similar prices. So it is the market of those times. And now when we sit today, like we sit today and we talk about these markets, we feel as if they are theoretical. So they today may not be existent, but at the time when the theory was propounded, these markets were actually existent in the world. So this is a so those theories are the replica of the post of the pre-colonization days and the post-industrialization days. So that is something which is there, right? So we'll talk when we talk about colonization and we talk about so we will talk about this dichotomous the dichotomy, and we'll talk about over determinism, and we'll talk about dialectics. So when we talk about these, we will come to explain these parts, but not right now, right? So now, having fixed this market structure, so is this market structure clear to us? Perfect. So let us now move to talk about the two most important components which is used to depict the market structure. So obviously, is one of them is the demand curve. and the other is the supply curve. Is the supply. Okay, so what does the demand curve talk about? Now this is something that we all know, right? So it shows a relationship between the price and the quantity demand, right? Now, if I talk about this price and the quantity demanded, what does this mean? So basically, what the demand curve shows us is willingness to pay. So it shows that to consume a certain amount of quantity, how much is it that an individual is willing to pay? How much is an individual willing to pay in order to consume a certain amount of quantity, quantity demand? So over here, if I plot this, quantity and there is price. And over here, what you have is have quantity demand, right? So how does the graph look like over here? Obviously, as the prices would increase, the demand for the commodity would kind of fall, right? So at a higher price, you would expect a lower quantity demanded. And at a lower price, we would actually expect a higher quantity demanded. So, so your D dashed is the demand curve for the commodity, right? So basically, what we are trying to say over here is that if at a higher price, the willingness to pay for the individuals is relatively lower. So there are a lower number of individuals who are willing to pay a higher price to get a certain amount of quantity. On the other hand, at a lower price, so when the price of the commodity is lower, there are larger number of people who are willing to pay a higher number of goods and services. So who are willing to pay for to attend the goods and services. So at a higher price, right? So the demand is lower, and at a lower price, the demand quantity demanded is higher, which means that people are willing to consume much more at lower prices than at higher prices. And hence, the demand curve is negatively related to the price of a commodity, right? So over here, we say that the quantity demanded is a function of the price, the demand price, right? So this is called your demand curve. Called your demand curve. So ideally, if you have a look into this, the price should have been on this x-axis and quantity demanded should have been on the y-axis, right? But over here, what we are trying to do is we are trying to say that so mostly what we plot over here is nothing but the inverse demand curve, PD as inverse of Q. What I'm trying to say is that corresponding to a given quantity demanded, what is the corresponding price? So the price over here is on the dependent variable and the quantity demanded is on the x-axis. So this is what we call the inverse demand curve. So in most of the analyses that we use, we always use the inverse demand curve and the inverse supply curve. We have the inverse demand curve, right? So, so the objective of this demand curve is to show the willingness of the customer, of the consumers to pay, right? So this reflects the demand side of the borrower. This reflects the demand side of the borrower. Demand side of the borrower. And hence, from where would I get it? I would get it from the consumers optimization problem. We'll get it from the consumers optimization. So in order to describe the consumers optimization problem, we will talk about, so how is that the consumer optimizes his payouts or his utility function. So it is there that we will kind of talk about the consumers optimization problem, talk about the preferences, we'll talk about the budget constraints and so on, right? So over here, what we are going to talk about is we are going to talk about so as of now we are not kind of going to talk about consumers optimization problem, just to focus on the demand curve, right? Now the question that comes out over here is that that how would you actually, so basically one thing that we know is that the demand curve is negatively sloped, right? Why? Because if the price of a commodity kind of goes up, it becomes more and more expensive, and hence with a given disposable income, I can buy lower units of the commodity, and hence the demand of the good price goes down. So that is where the negative slope of the demand curve comes in, and it's pretty intuitive. Similarly, another important part, or so the second set of the curve that we need to talk about over here would be the supply curves. So how would the supply curve look like? The supply curve obviously is positively sloping, because higher the price of a per unit price of a product is, higher will be the willingness of the producers to produce the good, right? So they will be willing to produce more and more amount of the goods. On the other hand, what happens is that as they produce higher and higher units, so they need, so their marginal cost of the production increases, and with that marginal cost of the production, the price also increases. And the reason is that for a perfectly competitive market, the profit is maximized at a part where the price equals the marginal cost, and that is obtained, or that is obtainable from the producer's profit maximization exercise, right? So we'll also explore the producer's profit maximization exercise as well. So we will look into two things from here. We look into, once we talk about the supply curve, we look into two things. How is it that the supply curve is coming, and how is it that the demand curve is coming? So what are the respective, see, the demand curve and the supply curve both will be the outcomes of an optimization problem, right? So the consumer is trying to optimize their incentive, and the supply curve and the producers are trying to optimize their incentives. So they together, so as they go ahead to kind of optimize their incentives, what we get to see is that they, each of their optimization problems lead us to a particular curve, to a demand curve or to a supply curve which comes in, and from there we can identify that we can actually explain why the demand curve is the negatively sloped and why the supply curve is positively sloped. So the so as we deep dive into it, the next stage is to deep dive will be this, to assess the derivation of these curves from their respective optimization problems, right? And then what we'll also talk about is how is it that they're optimized. So what are the final outcomes of the optimization problem? How has these optimization problems evolved, right? So how has the consumer's optimization problem evolved? How has the producer's optimization problem evolved, and so on. So we are going to talk about indifference curve approach. We are going to talk about isoquant approach, and we'll see that every time the whatever we do, so every time we end up with the positively sloped supply curve and a negatively sloped demand curve, but the explanation with every theorization becomes more and more robust, right? Okay, now while we talk about demand, right, a very interesting part is to talk about, so over here I have been talking about the demand for goods and services. I've been talking about the product market demand. Now there is a demand in the funds market or in the financial markets as well, right? So you have a financial market where there are demand for the funds, right? So the business, it is the businessmen or the borrowers who demand the funds, and the price over there is the rate of interest. And similarly, what you know is that there is a supply of funds, right? The supply of funds increases with an increase in the rate of interest, right? Now, there is a typical challenge with this particular market, with the particular, with when I talk about the demand for funds in the financial markets. So let's say 0, I have Q, which is the funds, and I have the rate of interest. It is the quantity of funds. And over here, what I'll have is the rate of interest. Right. So over here, you have the demand for funds, right? And over here, you have the supply of funds. So this is an equilibrium part. Now, so you have, so basically, so as the rate of interest goes up, so more and more people will be interested to keep money in the financial, so will be interested to keep money in the banks, and the lesser and the lesser and lower the rate of interest and lower will be the willingness to keep money in the with the banks, and hence the supply curve is positively slope. And similarly, higher the rate of interest, lower will be the demand for the funds. Right now, this is where the so so now what the bank wants to do is, so let's say, so there is this equilibrium part, right? So the demand and the supply curve interact. Now the next thing that happens is the bank wants to reduce its exposure. So it wants to control the quantity of the fund it gives out, right? And what the bank goes and do is they raise the rate of interest. The credit goes down, or the exposure goes down to Q1, and the rate of interest rises. And over here, so gradually the supply of the funds also reduce, and this is where your new equilibrium comes in. Right. So the rate of interest rises, the exposure of the bank reduces, the rate of interest goes up, the savings happen. Now, my question is that is this a good strategy which is taken by the bank? is it a good strategy taken by the bank? Yes. What do you think can be possibly be the challenge? Think. What do you think can be the possible challenge of this way of controlling the credit? Yeah, to answer, you can obviously unmute yourself and you can go ahead.
So this is Pankaj here.
Okay, hi Pankaj.
I believe, hi sir. Sir, I believe that the reason can be multiple. Might be they want to control the credit environment in the country because of might be
Yeah, so
inflationary factors.
that is fine. That they raise the rate of interest, the quantity of the credit exposure of the bank goes down. But what is the
Right.
challenge that this can pose?
So the challenge it can pose is which sectors to cut might be
For the
one
bank,
thing is
for
that.
the bank, for the bank, for that bank.
Sorry, I
The
didn't
bank
get you.
so which bank raise the rates of interest, right? So the quantity of the
Right.
credit goes down, right? And
Right.
similarly, the supply of the deposit will also go down and you move to a new equilibrium. But what challenges can this pose for the bank?
So I think one of the major challenges there net interest income of the bank because the
No, that will go
quantity
down.
demanded.
That goes down, but that is not the challenge. That's not the risk that the bank is posed to. So the income of the bank goes down, that is fine. That's understood. But at the same time, the interest income of the bank will also go up, right? Why will the net interest go down? The exposure has gone down. So let's say I was lending 100 rupee at 3%. Now I am lending 80 rupees at, let's say, 7%. Suppose. So my interest income is, there is a net benefit which I will get. That is fine. But even if my net interest may go down, that is fine. But I can pick that up in terms of my fee income, deposits, everything. But what risk am I exposing myself to?
Just a wild guess might be a non-diversification risk because I might end up putting my eggs into one basket, some specific type of loans only. Might be. I am
Not
not.
really, because the loans increase. See, if the rates increase, will increase all across, right? It will increase for both commercial portfolios, for retail loans, for everyone. It will increase. So you are not actually putting your eggs in the same basket.
Hmm.
So what this actually does is it controls your quantity of the credit, but it doesn't control the quality of your credit. So what you may do is, because the moment the rate of interest rise, it is highly likely that people who are good borrowers or who are potential good borrowers would screen out of your movement, and people who are willful defaulters or potential bad borrowers are the ones, or who are more indifferent to paying back and not paying back are the ones will enter into your cycle. So you end up with a problem of making you're reducing the exposure, but you also end up with the problem of increasing the delinquency rates in your portfolio. You end up with a problem of adverse selection, because when the rates of interest goes up, good borrowers who find it difficult to meet the credit obligation will move out. They'll not take the loan, they'll not apply for the loan. People who are applying for the loan are the one who are more risky players, right? So they are automatically risky borrowers because they are taking the loan, same loan at a higher rate of interest, right? And there is a large chance that many of them can turn out to be willful defaulters, especially in a current account portfolio. So if there's a current account or a revolving product and at a higher rate of interest someone is taking that up, there is a high chance that this guy may turn out to be a defaulter, because a diligent person who wants to pay back the loan, sincerely wants to pay back the loan at a higher rate of interest, would not subscribe to it because his interest payments would be higher. Hence, it is highly likely that he would move out of the cycle, and people who are more risky are would enter into the cycle. Hence, this exercise, even though it controls the quantity of the exposure, would not control the quality of the exposure, and hence you would end up with adverse selection. And that's where we need to. That's where the role of these risk management methods like these acquisition scorecards, behavior scorecards, they come in, which helps us assess the not only the quantity of the credit that is going out, but the quantity of the credit that is going out to the quality of the borrower. So it helps us assess the reliability and the affordability of the borrower. And hence, that's where the risk management programs or these risk management strategies play a very important role. Uh, and so this is where so this is where your understanding of economics and your practice actually comes into play, right? So this method, it controls the quantity of the credit but not the quality of the credit. And the person who is coming up to you and asking for your loan, you don't know, he could be type A, he could be type B. But with bureau information in place today and with acquisition scorecards, this type A and type B problem can be solved to a large extent. So the probability of the actual type of the borrower can be made, or we can make some ideas about it. So that entire, so it's not, so I did not say that this borrower A who has come up to me is a good person and borrower B who's come up to me is a bad person, and the probabilities are uniformly distributed. I can actually make out an idea about how risky he is through acquisition scoring of these borrowers, right? So so this method, so this demand supply graph shows us that you could actually control the quantity of the credit but not the quality of the credit. And in such a case, if you want to control the quantity of the credit by playing around with interest rates, right, by raising interest rates, you can end up with a potential problem of an adverse selection, right? Make sense? Right? So is it clear to everyone? Any questions on this? Anything anyone else would want to add on to this? Fine. Okay. So okay. So let's take a pause here for the day. So today we have kind of talked about a lot about, we introduced the concept of perfect competition. We have talked about the concept of demand curve. Demand curve. We have talked about the concept of the inverse demand curve. We have talked about markets as an institutions, right? And we ended this with the concept of adverse selection. So in the next class, we'll elaborate more on this concept of adverse selection. We'll talk more about this demand supply curve, and we'll study the dynamics of the demand supply curves in uh, in respect of the financial markets, in respect of the product markets, and we'll also talk about the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply curve and how is it that they are related. And then from there, we'll move on to talk about the optimization frameworks, right? And in cases and these instances, you will see that some of these parts from the some parts kind of start getting blended with industry practice that we generally are into, right? That I'm into. So you will also so I'll kind of try to blend around the things that for people who are doing a master's, you'll also get an idea as to how and where is it that you'll be applying these concepts, this concept that you have started, that you've been trained on in your grads and masters, into your industry practice. So will be looking into that as well. Okay, so so let's take a pause here for the day, right? And let's catch up next week. Your sessions will be available. Your recorded sessions will be available over the Google Drives in the next 2 days, right? So I'll upload, record them, and I'll share out the Google Drive link so that you can use them, right? Okay. So thank you guys. Thank you for your time on the weekends. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Pankaj.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.